Hi everyone, my name is Paidamwoyo Mangondo and I will be presenting this workshop on style for the Swedish Schools Debating Championships 2019. I'll begin with a general overview of the workshop. Today I'll be talking about what is style and what it is about. Then I'll go on to speak about individual style choices and stylistic decisions. The third thing I will speak about is style as a team and why it is that style is a strategic decision that can be made by all members of the team and as a team as a whole. The fourth thing I will address is practicing style and how you can do some of these activities at home to improve your own style, especially when you consider that you've got prepared motions that you'll be arguing at the championships. Finally, I'll give some general advice on style and some of the things that you can think about and do to improve your own speaking from a stylistic perspective. So let's begin. What is style? Style, at its core, is the manner you present your arguments and your content in. It considers vocal elements such as tone of voice and volume, but it also considers visual elements such as hand gestures, facial expressions, and posture. Style is incredibly important for three key reasons. The first reason why it's important is it overly makes your arguments easier to understand. It makes you easy to follow. It makes you clear, non-repetitive, interesting, and persuasive overly. The second reason why it's important is because we ought to recognize that all people that we are speaking to are humans. No one is robotic. And if humans were purely logical beings or organisms, then all we would require of you is to write down your speeches and then we would read them in order to be persuaded. But the important thing is that humans care. Humans have emotions. Humans have underlying subconscious attitudes and feelings towards things. And humans engage and interact. So style is the means by which you can engage, interact, activate your audience so that they care more about your message, that they overall find it more persuasive. The third reason why style is important is because in the format of debating that you are debating in, style contributes 40% of the score that you will receive. Content contributes 40% as well, while strategy only contributes 20%. And as a consequence, style is incredibly important. I personally do not believe that style is a category that exists in a vacuum on its own. It is important to use it strategically and use it in combination with the other categories and with the other components of persuasiveness in order to make yourself more compelling for the judges. It's for these reasons I might link it to the other workshops that you've received on framing, comparatives, as well as rebuttal, because I think it makes all of those things more compelling and more persuasive. So let's speak about what are some of the elements of style. And there are two parts to it. The first thing is the visual components of style, and the second is vocal. So when we're talking about visual components of style, we're talking about a few things. First is the hand gestures, and how you use them in communicating. Is it a strategic decision? Is it your hands flailing about endlessly? Second is facial expressions. We connect to people through their faces. And so your facial expression has a means of communicating a great deal. The third thing is eye contact. Whenever we communicate or speak to individuals, it is important to maintain that eye contact. The fourth thing has to do with the usage of props, and I don't mean pieces of evidence or tools that you would use during your speech. For example, some kind of case study or chart, because we don't allow that. What I'm specifically talking about is how do you interact with the physical environment around you? For example, your timer or stopwatch, your notes that you write, the podium at which you speak. All of those are important visual elements. The fourth thing is also about stance, and that relates to the posture that you have. Does it exude confidence, clarity, and understanding in your material? Or does it show that you're nervous and disinterested? The second components of style are all the vocal or oral components of style. Everything that relates to the voice, your tone. It relates to your volume. It relates to the voice modulation or the variation of tone and volume. It relates to the language decisions that you make. It also relates to your breathing and your use of pause when communicating a message. So for this part of the workshop, I'm going to talk about individual stylistic choices and how we can influence or affect those individual stylistic choices, beginning with breath and pause. Now, breath and pause are important for one simple and important reason. Breathing and pause are important because speaking requires the usage of your vocal system as well as your respiratory system. And any tool that requires that, or any skill that requires that, for example, singing or talking, requires the effective management and usage of breathing as pause as a consequence of that. Okay, so let's talk about breathing first. The important thing here is that you need to make sure that you're breathing correctly, that you're taking deep and adequate breaths so that you have enough breaths to speak. Often, you have noticed, and I've also noticed, we often run out of breath, or we've noticed when speakers run out of breath. They start to speak quickly, they chew on their words, and the pitch of their voice gradually increases, or there's a sharp increase. And when they decide to breathe, it often comes off as sharp and distracting. What you don't want to do is distract your audience or distract the judges. So you need to make sure that you're breathing. One way in which you do that is to ensure adequate posture. You may have noticed that I am a little bit short of breath as I'm speaking to you currently. That's because I'm sitting down and I'm hunching over. You want to make sure that you're standing up straight so that you allow as much air to flow in and out of your lungs. The second thing that allows us to improve our breathing in general is to take pauses. Often when we want to separate phrases or when we want to separate sentences. Make sure we take deep, clear breaths so that we have enough air. The third thing, and this is important as well, is that we ought to make sure we are breathing correctly right from the beginning. So when you walk up to the podium, you need to make sure that you take a couple of deep breaths first before you begin to speak. When you do that, you have already started the process of regulating and modulating your voice and also regulating your breath. And it's easier to continue breathing correctly when your starting point was correct, rather than to realize that you are breathing incorrectly during your speech when you've established a flow already. So remember those three things. Make sure your posture is correct. Take breaths and pauses between phrases. And finally, make sure you are breathing correctly from the beginning. Pause can also be an effective stylistic tool to place emphasis on certain words. Sometimes we want to break up certain things to give it more effect, more impact, so that people care about it. That's a tool that we often use rhetorically, not just to ensure that for the purposes of clarity. The second thing that's important when we're talking about style is language and vocabulary. There's a happy medium that we can achieve here. We want language and vocabulary that both makes the judge care, but is also really effective at communicating our message. We should avoid the over-reliance on complex debating terminology and the over-reliance on acronyms to make things simpler for us. Sometimes the best means of communicating is simple, clear, and concise. Obviously, oversimplification can be not a deterrent. Incorrect usage of language right there can often detract from the quality of our speeches. A good example would be if, for example, we have a speech which speaks to, or an argument which speaks to invading a country or using military intervention, we want to make sure that there is a reason, a real problem for doing so, as has been mentioned by Sharmila in her workshop. What we should then do is make judges care about the problem so much. So it's not enough to say that people have died. What you might want to do is give numbers to ensure that the gravity of the situation is understood. Or, for example, if you're talking about vulnerable people, you do not want to just simply say things are bad. You want to be a little bit more descriptive in your language choice. If you want people to care about particular principles or particular ethical or moral concerns and how infringements on those concerns are bad, you don't say that it is bad that a particular right is being removed from us. You might want to say it is an assault on our moral and ethical principles. That usage of that word is incredibly valuable because it makes people care a lot. So that sort of metaphorical language and decision can be incredibly helpful. Similarly, we often get stuck in certain linguistic traps in order to support ourselves because we are nervous or we are unsure. That linguistic trap is called a crutch. We go back to that particular word, sentence, or phrase repeatedly throughout our speeches. Linguistic traps, for example, are but also some people use particular debating related language. It's important for us to recognize what our linguistic trap is, and then we take note of it by writing it down or telling it to a friend, and then working towards undermining or getting past that particular trap. This concludes the first part of this workshop, which looked at what is style, what are the components of style, and some individual style choices that we might need to improve or consider when we're speaking, including breathing and pause, and language and vocabulary. In the next part of the workshop, I'll address other individual choices, style as a strategic decision, and so on. I'm going to address the second part of this workshop, including individual elements of style, as well as some strategic decisions. So, to begin, let's talk about posture and hand gestures. Now, posture and hand gestures are both parts of the visual elements of style. This is important because it enables physical presence and physical connection with the audience that you are addressing. The important thing about posture is to recognize that you are unconsciously and subconsciously communicating a message depending on your posture and how you are standing. So, a few key things to recognize as you are speaking. The first thing is that you should always make sure that you are facing your audience, speaking directly to the judges. That means that feet should be facing forward, your shoulders should be facing forward, and your face should be facing forward. It is quite possible that sometimes we want to look around the room as we're speaking to people, and that is okay, so long as our center often ends up at the judges because the judges are the people we're speaking to. The second thing with regards to posture is you need to make sure that you are standing up straight and upright. Anyone who is hunched over from an emotional or connection perspective are cutting themselves off from their audience. And so what you want to do is make sure that you're open up and you appear like you're engaging with the people that you're speaking to and that you are inviting them. The third thing about posture is that you need to ensure that your posture is comfortable enough so that you can ensure adequate breathing. I already mentioned why breathing is important, and I hinted at why breathing is important, or posture becomes important for your breathing. In a similar fashion, you ought to ensure that your posture is upright so that you can allow air to enter in and out of your lungs so that you have enough breath to speak adequately, but also to ensure that you have enough breath so that you don't cut off phrases, so that you don't get exhausted, you don't see that sharp increase in your pitch. Hand gestures are important because they often aid us in our communication. Now, the thing about hand gestures is we need to make sure that they are deliberate, that we made a decision to use them. Often, we aren't aware of what we're doing with our hands. We move them around rapidly. We get trapped in cycles of using the same hand gestures. And two things come from that. Either they become monotonous and they have no real effect in terms of persuasiveness. If I keep my hands down for some time and at some point in time I decide to point or list numbers or do something with them, that is aiding emphasis. And in that instance, they are effectively being used as a tool to communicate to the judges. You need to listen to this part. This thing is important subconsciously. If you're always moving them around constantly, the use that they have is quite often drowned out. They don't have the ability to create emphasis, to ensure importance, to communicate an effective message for the judges. The second thing is that when we don't have deliberate hand gestures, when we move them around far too much, they often detract from the message that we are trying to communicate to our audience. They become distractions as opposed to aids to our communication. So we shouldn't do this far too often, or this, because we often get, it's very tempting to do so. We should try as far as possible. We can keep them to our sides. We can have a neutral position where we keep them. And then when needed, we make use of the hand gestures for our audience. The next thing that we need to address under this is taking up space in the room. Because as the speaker at the podium, you want to be the commander. You want to be controlling the space, controlling the atmosphere for the 8 minutes that you are speaking. That is your opportunity to do so. So we need to make sure that we are taking up space. Now, space can be physical, in which case it is often much easier for people who are larger to have the illusion of taking up space in the room. But there are some simple strategies, some of which might be a little bit bizarre, which allow you to create the idea of taking up space, of, as a result of that, having presence in the room. The first thing is your posture, as already mentioned. Standing upright gives the air of confidence, and so you are taking up that space as the rightful commander of that room. The second thing that you can do is use your hand gestures in a way which allows you to take up space. Some people recommend that you have your hands to your sides, and you can't see it at the moment, but having your hands on the hips gives the air of taking up space in the room. It means that your body takes up more of the space. Other individuals recommend that you put one hand on your hip and the other one is raised in such a fashion, like a teacup. Again, I don't personally recommend that means of trying to take up space because it can appear as odd or bizarre. But one strategy which I think is useful and also makes you appear more opening and inviting is to try and make sure that the neutral position of your arms is palms up and spread out, almost like Jesus. So that it feels like you are embracing the room and you're embracing your audience. It gives the air of inviting, but also when you spread out your arms and move them further and further away from your body, it gives the illusion of taking up more space and having more control and command in the room. A number of debaters use this, whether consciously or unconsciously, and I find that to be a useful strategy. From that neutral position, it is also much easier to use hand gestures and move backwards towards that neutral position. The next thing is your notes. Now, we often take our note-taking strategies for granted, but our notes have the capacity to influence our hand gestures and our posture. We need to make sure that we have notes and speeches that best enable us to speak and deliver our message and don't distract from what we're doing. So that considers things such as the size of the note paper. Often people will take huge pieces of paper that they hold in front of them, and that is a physical barrier cutting you off from the rest of the room. Or other people will put a stack of papers on the desk, but in order to read that stack of papers, they have to hunch over. And when you do that, you cut your face off from your audience and you cut yourself off from being able to effectively communicate. So what are the best ways to take notes and to ensure we're not distracting? One is to recognize relatively what is your height going to be relative to where you can place your notes. Some people will keep key cards in hand or small pieces of paper that they then drop. This is a good strategy because you never have to hunch over or try and read. It's always within your range of reading, and you can look down briefly and then look up again. Your relative height is important because then that determines if you're at a desk, are you able to have papers on the desk so that it never looks like you're hunching over? Or if you're quite tall and you have to hunch over and pause to try and read all of your notes, that becomes distracting and undermines your style. The second thing is then size of the paper and so on. So make sure you take effective notes that if don't cut you off from the room and that don't require you to struggle to read them and make you stylistically unpersuasive. The next thing to talk about is introductions and conclusions. Now, we often take this for granted, and this is something I like to coach quite a bit. The reason why I do so is if you think about any interaction that you've had with a person, any interaction that you've had with a speaker, any interaction that you've had with someone giving a presentation, a debate speech, a parliamentary speech, we quite often decide whether or not we are going to listen to that individual within the first minute. And so introductions matter. How you send off people matters. And so you need to work on those. And importantly, start developing the skill of generating those under pressure in a prep room. So whenever you're outlining an introduction, often, as has been mentioned by one of the previous presenters, I think it was Sharmila, that you want to be able to frame the debate and control that space. You want to outline what is the problem, what is the scope of the debate, and whether or not there are limitations. In order to do an effective job of that and making judges care about that and care about your particular framing, there has to be a stylistic consideration that allows them to connect with that messaging. So what I often suggest? I suggest three things. First, the usage of evocative language. So that is language that people can connect with. Emotive language that gets people to care about the debate, the issue you are addressing. Previously, I spoke about why language in general is important. Here, it becomes especially important. If you are talking, for example, about torturing suspected terrorists to gain intel, you might want to talk about the scope and length of damage that those individuals can do in comparison to the wealth of benefits and the number of lives that you could save. That makes people care about your issue. This is something that is often reflected in reality. Often, we end up engaging with emotive people that get us to care about issues, people that get us to connect. You can see this effect most often in the realm of politics. A note here is it's not an opportunity to exaggerate. It is an opportunity to get people to care more. So very obvious exaggerations are likely to be considered unpersuasive. So there is a fine line between that. If you want a good example of this, you can look for the Prime Minister's speech from the World University Debating Championships 2011 that were held in Botswana. The speaker was Victor Finkel. The second thing that you would need to do is outline the trend or pattern of behavior. So in this case, what you want to do is show that the behavior, if you want to show that it's bad, is getting worse and worse and worse. Or if it's good, it's getting better and better and better. That way, people see that there's a gradual progression which instills a sense of urgency. Once you've done that, the third thing is your tipping point. Why is it important to address this matter now? Why is it so crucial? Why have we reached the point of no return? And we can use language, numbers, statistics, and case studies to aid us in that particular endeavor. So I've been talking about individual elements of style and what you can do as an individual to improve your style, but also what are some individual components, some of them, not the entire set. Speaking about vocabulary and language, speaking about breathing and pause, speaking about hand gestures and posture. Now, I want to think about style for the team because it's something that we don't necessarily think about. We often think about the content for the team, what content needs to be carried over between the speakers. We speak about the same team strategy, ensuring that we're all on the same team, ensuring the same sort of framing. And if you can consider that all of those things need to be consistent between speakers, then there are some things about the style which need to be agreed upon between the speakers. They don't need to be consistent because we are all speakers who have different ways of speaking, but they have to be varied. And there needs to be some consensus between the team that if our framing is going to be this on this particular issue, what is each person going to contribute stylistically in order to ensure that that particular issue or our framing or our understanding of the debate is guaranteed and continued. So let's start with the first component: branding, language, and team lines. Now, the first thing that's really important is that often as a team, we carry over the same branding or same ideas, same philosophy, same understanding of the case. And so, if that is the situation, then we ought to be carrying over the same framing. For example, the framing needs to be consistent between the speakers. Now, presumably, we want our framing or understanding of the issue to be carried forward and emphasized across all speakers. Now, given that framing isn't purely a logical issue or a reasoning issue, that there's a communicative issue to consider, some emotional aspects to consider, then it is important that the tone and the vocabulary behind that framing is carried over. It gives it importance, it gives it more value in the debate. And if you are able to carry that over across the speeches, that is something that judges can connect with. Some forms of repetition are important so that judges are aware of it, that you signal to judges that this is important, that this is what the debate is about. And so that is important to carry over between speakers. If you're going to be branding something as an assault of our very human dignity, that is powerful that is powerful branding that if you carry across the team, judges acknowledge it, it signals to them, they find it persuasive. Second thing to talk about is team lines, because often from your case that you would have spent time building, you are then able to come to a team line. And when you get to that team line, it's important that it is consistent between the speakers as well. Some people like to use things, literary devices in order to give it a little bit more emphasis, things like onomatopoeia and so on. That can be a decision that you come to as a team in order to do so. You can look for several different videos online where this is carried forward. In particular, you can use the semifinals and finals of WSDC 2015 with Team Singapore. In particular, the finals, where they speak about a universal basic income, a UBI, and talk about how it is a fundamental human right, and talking about how a dignified life is important. And that team line is carried consistently across all three speakers. It is almost always mentioned at the beginning or end of their speeches. So that sort of team line and branding also places emphasis on the things that you as a team find important. Style is a strategic decision. You make certain decisions about particular pieces of framing. You make particular decisions about how you are going to frame a problem. You make particular decisions about what the way up ought to be. So those are all logical and reasoning based decisions that you are deciding to make as a team, as a collective. And so you want judges to have a particular messaging and a particular understanding of your arguments. In the same way, style is used to communicate that message and communicate those arguments. And so it also needs to be a strategic decision. If you want something to be emotional or emotive, then you make the stylistic decision to do so. That is a strategic decision. For example, when emphasizing problems in a particular debate, the decision to use emotive language places emphasis on that argument and hence is a strategy that you are using. Individuals can choose to do this, but it's also helpful and useful for the team to agree that this is what we want communicated and come to that agreement and pushing that forward. In a similar way, if you want something to be understood as very clinical issue to deal with, then you also perhaps want to have a stylistic decision for it to be more, for the issue to be argued in a more analytical sense. And so, in that vein, you as a team can make a stylistic, strategic decision about what and how the message ought to be communicated to the judges. Or, for example, there are important pieces of framing, analysis, or comparisons that you really want the judges to listen to. You as a team can indicate to a speaker to place emphasis on this. How the speaker chooses to do so depends on the speaker themselves, or you can decide as a team. One important strategy which I find is very useful is when reaching important pieces of framing, analysis, or comparison, you ought to slow your speech down so that it is far more clear and audible for the judges. You might also want to change the tone of your voice. There is a natural tone or volume that we use when we are speaking in general, and we often fall naturally into that tone. You may want to differentiate the tone so that it signals to judges, consciously or subconsciously, that there's a variation, and so you're indicating that there's something that is important, or there is a difference, right? You often have superfluous analysis and then you have important analysis. You want to differentiate those. You might also want to make use of hand gestures. Pointing indicates that something is important. Or, for example, you might want to change your posture slightly to indicate to judges that this is really, really important. So, style is often a strategic decision that enables emphasis as well. So, the next thing to talk about is variance, because an important thing to consider with style is that there needs to be variation. If style is consistent within a speech, it becomes monotonous and boring. People turn off. They switch off. They no longer find that interesting. In the same way that there needs to be variance within the speech, there also needs to be variance within the team. Speakers ought to speak in different ways to create that variation so that we can differentiate between the speakers. That way, the speeches become more interesting for the judge to listen to. But an advanced speaker would also recognize that there's need for variance in the room. So, for example, you might have your prime minister or first proposition speaker be a very energetic and emotional speaker. The first opposition speaker is also energetic and emotional. The second proposition speaker is also emotional and energetic. That creates a general homogeneous tone, consistent tone within the room. And that can either be consistently overwhelming or eventually we become bored with the same tone. Very smart speakers can realize that this is now happening, and so maybe a second op speaker or even the second prop speaker realizes it's time to differentiate the tone and the nature of the style in the room. So they then make the strategic decision to vary their tone to shift from what we've heard from the different speakers. That creates variance, it creates differentiation, it creates difference, and it allows judges to engage a little bit more. So let's talk about practicing style. I can recommend many different things, but at the heart of this issue is that in order to improve and get better with style, you must practice speaking regularly. Style, or rather speaking, is a skill very similar to singing. We are using breath, we have to modulate our voices, and we have to think about what it is that we're going to be doing. And in order to improve that skill, we have to practice all the time, every day. A good opportunity for you is as you're preparing your cases for the prepared rounds for SSDC 2019, you can practice your speeches in advance. That way, you are repeating, you're instilling the skill, you're ensuring that you're preparing. I've got 3 skills, additional skills, or additional exercises that you can make use of. The first exercise, recording your voice. The important thing here is we cannot hear what the true quality of our voice is by listening to ourselves speak as we are speaking. The reason for this is simple. As we speak, we generate oscillations or vibrations in the air, and these vibrations travel to our ear, so we hear our voice in that way. But as you are speaking, our vocal cords are also vibrating, resulting in vibrations in our skull. And these vibrations spread out, lowering our voices, adding some bass to it. So we need to record our voices as we speak. When we do that, I would suggest you identify 3 good things you've done in that speech and 3 things that require improvement. When you do that, you work towards improving those 3 things and work towards repeating the 3 good things. Here, it is important to note that you should write them down. Often writing is a skill that helps us to remember and ensures emphasis, so we should write them down. In the same way that we record our voices, it is ideal to also record ourselves speaking in front of a small audience using video. That way, we are able to see what our posture, hand gestures, and all of the other visual elements of style are like. That ensures that we can record 3 things we do well and 3 things that we do poorly. The third thing to talk about is stuttering. Now, stuttering often comes from us not being prepared or not being aware of what it is that we're going to say next, or it is just an involuntary reaction to nerves. In order to deal with stuttering, I suggest two things. The first thing is to practice and make sure you are aware of what it is that you are going to say well in advance. Make it clear, make it understandable, make sure you practice, record yourself speaking, and ensure that you are able to gradually eliminate any of the stuttering. The second thing that I would recommend is ensure that if it's an impromptu round, you've at least gone through your speech once and you are prepared for what it is that will come at any point in time in the speech. Often it is important to create mental notes of what you're going to do in advance, especially from a stylistic perspective. An additional approach, which is a bit unusual, is singing. If you've noticed, regardless of whether you can sing on key or off key, we basically never stutter when we are singing. So you can practice singing in the privacy of your own home and sing repeatedly before you have to speak. That way, you create a trend, you create a pattern where you are having to use your vocal cords, your jaw, in ways where you don't stutter, where it doesn't lock and you have these repeated phrases. And once you've practiced a bit of singing, then you can try speaking. Naturally, this requires a lot of time. This is a very extensive way of doing it. But over the course of time, you might be able to eliminate the stuttering. The final thing I'm going to address in this workshop is some general points or general ideas or pieces of advice that you can make use of when considering style and preparing for any debating competition. The first and the most important thing is practice makes perfect. You must practice all the time. You must practice regularly. If you aren't preparing for a debating competition, perhaps join a public speaking or a Toastmasters club. Those are excellent opportunities to practice the art of speaking and speaking skillfully and speaking with style. The second thing that you can do is recognize that no one size fits all. We ought to recognize that each person is different. We have different personalities, different intuitions, different beliefs, and different skills. As a result, we also need to recognize that we're going to have different speaking styles. We might have people that we look up to. We might look up to, Sheng Wu Li, Bo Seo. We might look up to Rory Flynn. All of these incredible speakers that we've had in debating. But we shouldn't try to be them because they have their own speaking styles that they've successfully managed to achieve. What we need to do is find our own style, our own manner of speaking, and we need to make sure that we adapt to that. That takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of recording ourselves and listening to ourselves speak. It also takes a lot of humility in that regards, because it requires you to get feedback and criticism from judges in order to do so. The third thing that relates to that is that you need to learn to evolve. You might believe that you have one particular style of speaking, but sometimes it changes, or sometimes it's not best suited for us, or it might need to change depending on the needs of the debate. As a result, we need to be able to evolve not only rapidly within a debate, but also over time, depending on how we grow as debaters, or depending on what our skill set ends up being. Fourth is that you should be yourself. Often the best speakers are able to convey the message while being themselves, while being comfortable with themselves, while being assertive of themselves and who they are and what kind of speaker they are. But it also requires you to be comfortable with your style and your manner of speaking. As I mentioned before, you need to find it and tune it and practice that particular style. And then you are best able to be yourself on the debate stage. Some additional general tips. In the same way that we write down our strategic or content based decisions, we should also probably write down some style based decisions in our notes. Highlight where we want to place emphasis or make a note to slow down at this particular point in time. If that's too much effort, we need to make a mental note before we get up to speak. Perhaps in the moments as you're standing up at the podium, you are quickly assessing or making mental decisions about what sort of style you ought to be using at a particular point in time. Or where is it that you want to place emphasis and stylistic differentiation? The final thing is remember to accept and welcome criticism because often the audience is the one who gets to see you speak. You don't necessarily get to see or hear yourself speak as accurately as they do. So they have insight that you might not necessarily have. For example, a good friend of mine watched a debate video of mine from a final of a debating competition. The first thing that they asked is, why are you speaking at such a high pitch that is not comparable to your normal voice? And I realized, particularly when I'm nervous or I'm anxious, I don't take note of which pitch I'm speaking with. And I also don't take note of the breath and my breathing. So as a result, while my speech might have a lower pitch at the beginning, it rapidly increases and I start speaking quickly at a very high pitch. So before I speak, I have to take note right before, drop your pitch and slow down your speech so that everyone can understand you. I hope this workshop has been incredibly valuable and useful. If you do want to ask me any questions, please feel free to ask me. You can find me on social media, and I look forward to seeing all of you at the Swedish Schools Debating Championships 2019. Take care.